mindset shift. That's what I want to talk about today. That's what I want to rant about, is how we need to have a mindset shift in EOS if we want to move forward at a faster, more rapid pace. And it's this idea that at launch of the network, there were certain components that were designed to be in place and that weren't in place, and how all that came about, and how essentially that leads to where the ENF is today, how the ENF came about, and where we want to go, and that mindset that we all have kind of as a remnant of where we come from, but how we need to change that if we want to go where we're heading, and how that compares to other ecosystems. And all right, let's get into this. So it's the idea when EOS first launched in the white paper, there was a certain amount of inflation that was going to be dedicated to the block producers, and a certain amount of inflation dedicated to a worker proposal system. So it was a 1% to block producers and 4% to worker proposal system. That was the idea in the white paper. Now, we all know that the 4% essentially was going in a saving bucket that was never leveraged. There was no worker proposal system. And the idea wasn't that we didn't have access to tokens. It was the idea that we didn't have a means by which we could figure out who would have access to those tokens, how they would spend those tokens, what the governance would be around the WPS, etc. So EOS didn't launch with a WPS, and EOS also didn't launch with a foundation, right? So compared to other chains, they launched with a foundation. There was a foundation that was appointed at launch. There was a foundation that was already known prior to launch. And they also started with a vast amount of tokens. In a lot of cases, we're talking between 10, 30, 40% of all token supply were gifted to the foundations at launch. And in EOS, we didn't have that. We had this idea that we could potentially have this entity or some type of a system that would be used for builders, but it never came about. So what resulted in that was that the only actors within the ecosystem that were being paid by the network were block producers. And what we saw was that there's a lot of teams that came to EOS that wanted to build on EOS and wanted to essentially be compensated for their work, and they wanted to, just like anybody else, be part of the ecosystem and being able to work in the ecosystem. There's a cost to that, and they want to be able to survive, to live. They've got bills to pay and such. And the only way to do that was to call reg produce. And the idea behind that was that if you wanted to have access to funds from the network, you needed to be a BP. And so our mindset quickly became, after launch, the BPs would be taking care of everything. They would be doing the block production, but they would also be doing all these other things that we want. Whether it be marketing, community management, development, application, tools, etc., etc. We essentially placed all of that responsibility on the block producers because they were the only ones, or that was the only means by which people could get paid by the network. And that's a result of not having a WPS at launch. Now, we were in that system for roughly 3.5 years, where the only means by which you could get funded by the network was to call reg produce, regardless of whether or not you wanted to be a block producer, whether or not you even had the skill set to be a block producer. That was the only way that maybe you could get paid by the system. And what we see now with the ENF is that through decentralization, compared to other foundations and other ecosystems, the ENF is the only foundation that I know of that stems out of decentralization, that came from the system itself, that wasn't appointed at launch, and that didn't launch with a vast amount of token supply right from the get-go. And so it's a completely different system. But for the first time, we're now in a position where instead of saying, why aren't the block producers doing X, Y, Z? What I'm asking people to do, and the challenge on our end, is to say, what is the ecosystem missing? We're missing X? Great. Instead of saying the block producers aren't doing X, what we should be thinking is, how can we now develop, or how can we achieve, how can we output X because we justify, or we deem that X is important, X is needed. These other ecosystems always thought this way because they had access to the capital. They had access to an entity that could make X happen. In our case, we had no choice. It had to come from the block producers. So it's no fault of anybody. The underlying issue was always that the network launched without a worker proposal system. We are in a place now where we essentially have a worker proposal system to a certain extent that is the ENF that can keep applicants accountable through various means, whether it be through Eden, and they've got their governance process, whether it be through Pomelo, and they've got essentially their distribution process as well, or direct relationships with the ENF. We're able to accelerate that process so that we can enable businesses, developers, individuals to build on EOS, but we've got to play catch up. And so we're doing so extremely quickly. We're trying to do this, but we're doing so running from behind, not only from a period of time, but also from a capital point of view. Again, these other ecosystems started off with foundations. They started off with massive treasuries. They have been able to put their treasuries at work, not just deploying capital, but actually taking their treasuries, vast amount of treasuries. Like a big part of this is just having access to a lot of token and being able to manage those treasuries from a financial point of view to grow that treasury. We don't have that luxury. So again, the idea behind this rant, we need to change our mindset. Instead of thinking, why aren't the block producers doing X? Think, what is X? Is it important? How? Now with the current parameters that we have in place, we have funding that's been unlocked through the ENF, that's flowing through to Pomelo, to Eden, eventually to Fractally and such. How can we determine what is missing and where is the best venue, or what's the best department, let's say, for that to be achieved under? Great, let's do that. And that's a mind shift change. I want everybody to change their mindset. We now have the possibility. What are we missing? How do we do it? Let's go for it. What do you think?